February 20th, 1945. Northern Sector, Iwo Jima. Japanese lookouts positioned along fortified lines observed a group of unfamiliar American armored vehicles advancing across the gray, ash-covered landscape. The black smoke trailing behind them was unusual, not the result of combat damage, but something inherent to the vehicles themselves. As the lead tank rotated its turret toward a reinforced concrete emplacement, the observers noted an unfamiliar modification in place of the standard cannon, a nozzle-like extension. A sharp mechanical hiss followed, reminiscent of pressurized air being released. In an instant, a jet of ignited fuel surged forward, sweeping across more than 150 yards of volcanic terrain and consuming a nearby pillbox in a firestorm of thick, incendiary destruction. The cries of the defenders were brief, cut short by the rapid and overwhelming nature of the attack. Frantically, Japanese troops reached for field telephones, desperate to report the unprecedented weaponry they had just encountered. These were Sherman tanks adapted to deploy flamethrowers, a technology unfamiliar to Japanese forces, representing a tactical innovation that would alter the intensity and character of the fighting on the island. Unknown to those defending Iwo Jima, these vehicles were the product of months of clandestine experimentation at Hawaii's Schofield Barracks. Naval engineers had labored tirelessly to merge the industrial strength of the United States with battlefield demands, producing machines that one Marine battalion commander would later describe as the most effective single weapon in the campaign. The second day of the battle had begun, and the calculus of casualties was about to shift dramatically. These 8 specialized tanks alone would account for more than 30% of the enemy losses through direct incineration, a grim statistic that would haunt veterans on both sides for decades. The Imperial Japanese Army had spent the preceding year transforming Iwo Jima into an almost impregnable fortress. 8 square miles of volcanic rock had been systematically converted into defensive positions that challenged conventional military logic.
General Kuribayashi, who had assumed command of the island's defenses in June 1944, recognized the impossibility of outright defeating the American assault. His strategic goal was fundamentally different: to exact such a high cost from U.S. forces that any future plans to invade the Japanese home islands might be reconsidered. Kuribayashi had studied prior Japanese defeats in Saipan, Peleliu, and the Philippines, noting that traditional tactics, meeting the enemy at the shoreline, launching massive banzai charges, proved catastrophically ineffective against modern firepower. In response, he made a decisive departure from centuries of warrior tradition. Open-field, heroic charges would be abandoned. Instead, his roughly 21,000 troops were to fight from concealed, subterranean positions, turning Iwo Jima into a networked death trap beneath the surface. By February 1945, Japanese engineers had completed 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, with plans to extend the system to 17 miles. These passages descended as deep as 7 stories into the volcanic rock. More than 5,000 caves and underground chambers had been hollowed out, with many large enough to accommodate 300 to 400 men at a time. Around 1,500 fortified positions were strategically distributed across the island, each reinforced with concrete walls up to 4 feet thick and steel rods salvaged from abandoned projects. These bunkers were carefully sited to create interlocking fields of fire, and every accessible surface of the island could be targeted by guns hidden behind armored doors, which opened only to fire and closed immediately to shield occupants from counterattacks. The meticulous preparation, combined with innovative American weaponry, set the stage for one of the most brutal confrontations of the Pacific Theater, where industrial ingenuity and tactical adaptation would collide with centuries of traditional martial strategy. The network of subterranean passages on the island was nothing short of an extraordinary engineering achievement. Air shafts, cleverly blended into the surrounding volcanic formations, fed clean air into the depths below. Medical units had carved out complete underground hospitals, equipped with operating rooms and built to sustain as many as 400 injured soldiers at a time. 75 feet beneath the surface, communication hubs linked the garrison through an extensive web of buried telephone lines that stretched for miles. Vast storerooms were packed with enough water, rice, and munitions to support a 2-month encirclement. Beneath Hill 382 lay the most imposing structure, a cavern roughly 50 meters long and 20 meters across, large enough to shelter an entire battalion in relative safety. General Kuribayashi distributed his units with deliberate, almost mathematical care. In the south, around the volcanic cone of Mount Suribachi, he placed a semi-autonomous command under Colonel Kanehiko Atsuchi. Roughly 2,000 troops there operated artillery positions capable of targeting the beaches where an American landing was expected. Farther north, on the broad plateau where natural features favored defense, Kuribayashi stationed the majority of his forces, about 15,000 men he directed personally. Between these two fortified regions, a centrally positioned reserve of 4,000 could shift rapidly through the tunnels to reinforce any sector that came under threat. Although U.S. intelligence acknowledged that Iwo Jima would be heavily defended, the sheer complexity of this underground stronghold remained invisible to aerial reconnaissance.
For 74 straight days, American bombers had hammered the island, releasing 6,800 tons of explosives. Naval guns had added another 22,000 shells. Allied commanders assumed this sustained bombardment had collapsed most enemy defenses. The general expectation was that the island would be secured within 5 days. That assumption proved disastrously optimistic. Fewer than 200 of the approximately 1,500 hardened defensive sites were destroyed. The tunnels, the heart of Kuribayashi's defensive concept, survived almost entirely intact. The vast majority of Japanese personnel remained unharmed by the massive firepower directed at them. 5 months before the assault, at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, Colonel George F. Onmacht gathered a specialized team that would reshape the role of armored units in the Pacific War. A veteran officer with more than 4 decades of service, Onmacht led the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service's most secret initiative in the Central Pacific, known as CNPAC. His assignment was clear, but formidable. Create a weapons system capable of neutralizing the deeply buried caves and reinforced strongpoints that had repeatedly withstood conventional bombardment. He began with the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company, but he knew the task demanded far broader technical expertise. He requested 25 skilled personnel from the 117th Naval Construction Battalion, Seabees renowned across the Pacific for their mechanical ingenuity and improvisational engineering. To this group, he added specialists from the 5th Marine Tank Battalion and the 81st Ordnance Company. The result was an unusual joint service task force united by one objective: designed a machine capable of flushing Japanese defenders out of their underground shelters. At the center of the technical work were 2 Seabees, Machinist's Mate First Class A. Riker and Electrician's Mate Second Class Joseph Klee. Their names never appeared in public wartime reports, yet their innovations would ultimately save thousands of American lives. Both men had first-hand experience from earlier island campaigns, where they had witnessed Marines die attempting to assault fortifications that artillery could not destroy. They recognized that the fundamental challenge was not a lack of destructive power. It was delivering that power in a way that could reach enemy fighters concealed deep inside the earth. The obstacles were significant. Previous efforts to mount flamethrowers onto tanks had produced unreliable and inconsistent results. Early Army conversions were little more than improvised field adaptations, portable flamethrowers strapped to armored hulls. The Chameleon units had obtained 30 of the Canadian-designed Ronson units, but thickened fuel limited their effective range to 60 to 80 yards, and fuel supplies allowed for only half a minute of continuous firing. Maintenance issues plagued the system, and in combat conditions, the failure rate climbed above 40%, making the weapons dangerously unpredictable. The earliest significant progress in American flamethrower tank development emerged from experiments with modified M3 light tanks, machines that the crews informally labeled Satan tanks. The 43rd Chemical Company's first prototype, known as Hells of Fire, proved that vehicle-mounted flame weapons could be a viable battlefield tool. Yet its trials also revealed weaknesses impossible to ignore. The turret could rotate only halfway around, limiting firing arcs. The flame projector itself had narrow elevation limits, and the M3's thin armor left the crew exposed to the Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns commonly emplaced in defensive networks. It was obvious to Onmok's engineering group that a sturdier platform was essential.
Acting through high-priority Navy and Marine Corps channels that reached all the way to Admiral Chester Nimitz's command staff, UNMA's team secured 8 M4A3 Sherman medium tanks for conversion. These 35-ton vehicles, driven by a 500-horsepower Ford GAA V8, carried armor plates ranging from 25mm to 76mm, substantially thicker than the M3's protection. Their standard armament consisted of a 75mm main gun and several .30 caliber machine guns, and their rugged battlefield performance in Europe had already demonstrated how well they could withstand anti-tank fire. The Shermans solved the survivability problem, but merely acquiring hulls was only a first step. The decisive leap occurred when engineers Riker and Kell proposed merging the most effective elements of 3 separate flamethrower systems: the British Ronson, the Navy's Mark I, and several captured German mechanisms recovered in North Africa. What followed was an intense period of around-the-clock labor in the heat of Hawaii. Technicians slept beside their equipment, rotating through shifts as they welded and fabricated components. Out of this effort came a machine no military had previously fielded. The final design, officially designated CBH-1, Construction Battalion Hawaii Model 1, marked a substantial advancement in armored flamethrower technology. Installing the system required extraordinary craftsmanship: roughly 150 pounds of welding rod, more than 1,000 electrical connections, each essential to system reliability, and around 150 custom-machined parts per tank. Each conversion demanded roughly 1,200 labor hours and cost between $20,000 and $25,000 at the time, roughly $360,000 in current value. From a technical standpoint, the CBH-1 was far ahead of previous flamethrowers. It operated at approximately 300 psi, nearly triple the pressure of earlier models, and could project a stream of thickened fuel out to 150 yards, several times farther than a man-portable unit. Its fuel, developed by the 43rd Chemical Laboratory, was a carefully balanced mixture of diesel, gasoline, and napalm thickener, capable of burning at around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Although the system allowed for up to 80 seconds of continuous flame, doctrine recommended short bursts lasting only a few seconds to maintain precision and conserve fuel. A crucial innovation lay in how the weapon was mounted. Instead of being fixed externally, the flamethrower replaced the Sherman's main cannon, allowing the crew to employ the tank's existing fire control systems. The operator could traverse the turret a full 270 degrees and adjust elevation from -10 degrees to +35 degrees, using the same periscopes, controls, and optics used for conventional gunnery. As a result, crews required only minimal retraining to transition from firing shells to directing flame. Beyond the engineering, there was an important psychological dimension. The modified tanks received the same olive drab paint used on standard Marine Corps Shermans, with no distinctive markings. To Japanese defenders observing from caves or bunkers, the vehicles looked entirely ordinary, until the moment they released a jet of fire. At that point, deception had already done its work.
The internal fuel system reflected the same level of careful planning. The main storage tanks carried about 290 gallons of thickened fuel, supplemented by 10 gallons of unthickened fuel used for ignition. A separate nitrogen-filled pressure cylinder replaced earlier compressed air systems. Nitrogen was chosen specifically because it would not sustain combustion if the tank were punctured. Multiple redundant safety features were incorporated to prevent the catastrophic onboard fires that had plagued older flamethrower vehicles. Meanwhile, deep beneath Hill 382, General Kuribayashi supervised his defensive preparations with the same mathematical rigor that defined all of his planning, unaware that a radically new American weapon system was nearing completion. The Japanese defensive grid on the island was engineered so that fields of fire overlapped with mathematical precision. Observation teams hidden in narrow subterranean cavities, small pits scarcely visible from ground level, could call in artillery fire on any coordinate in mere moments. Machine gun emplacements were arranged so that their lines of fire met and crossed, pushing assaulting troops toward predetermined kill zones where artillery had already been zeroed in. The senior Japanese commander on the island relied on a doctrine that appeared almost minimalist in its elegance. Conserve ammunition, stay buried, and force the Americans to expose themselves first. His standing directives, communicated down to the lowest officer, left no room for interpretation. No unit was to initiate large-scale counterattacks. Every soldier was to remain in position until overrun, and then continue fighting with grenades, blades, or, if necessary, their bare hands. The commander's ruthless arithmetic suggested that if each of the roughly 21,000 defenders managed to kill 10 attackers, the American casualties would exceed the total invasion force. By this stage of the Pacific War, Japanese defensive theory had changed dramatically from the early island battles. Intelligence reports from Saipan and Peleliu had underlined just how vulnerable U.S. flamethrower operators were. The sooty plume produced by their diesel-based fuel made them instantly recognizable. Their limited effective range forced them to step into exposed positions and linger long enough to become perfect targets. In several earlier operations, as much as 70% of flamethrower operators had been killed, and in some units, the death rate reached 92%. Training for Iwo Jima emphasized specialized anti-flamethrower tactics. Machine gun teams were told to focus on the unmistakable silhouette of the twin fuel tanks carried by flame operators. Snipers were specifically issued extra ammunition for the same purpose. Infantry squads rehearsed rapid charges on flamethrower troops, exploiting the blind zone where the nozzle could not be depressed low enough to stop a close-range rush.
What Japanese planners failed to anticipate was that the Americans would introduce armored flamethrowers, Sherman tanks equipped with powerful flame-projecting systems. These vehicles could move toward defensive positions under layers of steel and fire incendiary streams far beyond the range of a man-portable unit. Japanese defenses, which had been expertly reinforced to resist bombing and naval gunfire, offered no meaningful protection against burning fuel that could pour through vents, cracks, and firing slits. What had been fortresses against explosives became lethal traps when saturated with flame. 8 of these modified tanks, M4A3 flamethrower Shermans, came ashore with the assault troops on February 19th.
D-Day. They were mixed among the standard Shermans of the 4th and 5th Tank Battalions. Although their official Marine Corps identifier was M4A3R5, various documents list them under alternative designations, such as POA-CWS-H1 or CB-MK-1. Arriving in the 5th wave just after 10,000 hours, the flamethrower tanks were initially held back in accordance with Navy guidance. Commanders wanted to evaluate the situation before risking the machines, which were extremely limited in number and irreplaceable in the short term. The 8 vehicles were split evenly between the 4th Marine Division and the 5th Marine Division, assigned numerical IDs from 431 to 438. A few crews painted informal names, Hellfire, Corkscrew, Blaze of Glory, but most of the tanks bore no outward sign of their capabilities. For the first day of the landing, these specialized tanks remained idle near the beach, while Marines suffered catastrophic losses attempting to advance inland. The volcanic ash, thick enough to swallow a man's boots, slowed every movement and exhausted advancing troops. Attempts to use traditional infantry tactics failed almost immediately. Naval bombardment had done little to damage bunkers buried beneath layers of rock and reinforced concrete. Artillery merely scarred the surface of defensive positions built to shrug off direct strikes from battleship-caliber shells. Many Sherman tanks bogged down or were destroyed by concealed anti-tank guns. By nightfall on D-Day, the Marines had pushed barely 700 yards from the shoreline, far short of the goal of seizing the first airfield. The casualty count for the day reached 2,420 killed or wounded. The beach had become a concentrated killing zone under revived Japanese artillery fire. The morning of February 20th, D+1, brought even greater urgency. The 21st Marine Regiment had been stalled while attempting to cross Motoyama Airfield No. 1. 3 reinforced pillboxes dominated the terrain, their overlapping fire turning a 200-yard-wide belt into a near-certain death trap. 2 rifle companies had already been shattered in repeated frontal attempts. Within just 2 days, the regiment had lost 35% of its strength. Recognizing that conventional assaults were impossible, Lieutenant Colonel William Duplantis, commander of 3rd Battalion, 21st Marines, gave the order that would alter the course of the battle. He requested the flamethrower tanks. At 14:20 hours, the first M4A3R5 flamethrower tank rolled into action. Vehicle number 431, led by Staff Sergeant Robert Meza, an experienced tanker with combat history on Saipan and Tinian, approached the enemy fortifications from an angled path, using the scattered remains of wrecked Japanese aircraft for concealment. To Japanese defenders, it appeared indistinguishable from the many Shermans that had already failed to breach the position. Inside the tank, the 5-man crew prepared intense coordination. Driver PFC James Morrison steered through the shifting ash that threatened to mire the 35-ton vehicle. Assistant driver Robert Chen manned the whole machine gun, scanning for infantry attempting close attacks. Loader Corporal Anthony Vitelli monitored the flamethrower's pressure system, 300 psi, the ideal level for maximum range. Gunner Corporal Thomas Carlson adjusted his sights toward the nearest pillbox through his periscope. When the tank closed to roughly 125 yards from the target, Meza issued the command that would inaugurate a new phase of the battle. Gunner, flamethrower, pillbox, fire. The CBH-1 flamethrower was deployed with a ferocity that witnesses described as unmatched, likening its eruption to a weapon of infernal origin. A viscous mixture of napalm and fuel oil was propelled through the air by compressed nitrogen, striking the apertures of enemy pillboxes with exceptional precision. On contact, the incendiary liquid flowed into the fortifications like molten rock, overwhelming the interior almost instantly.
Temperatures inside the concrete emplacements soared beyond 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit in mere seconds, consuming oxygen so rapidly that defenders often suffocated before the flames could reach them. Those few who survived the initial inferno tried to escape through rear exits, only to be met by Marines who had anticipated these attempts and positioned themselves for lethal interception. Sergeant Meza maneuvered the turret 30 degrees to engage a second pillbox. The defenders were more prepared this time. A Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun fired at point-blank range, its shell striking the Sherman's frontal armor and bouncing harmlessly upward. Despite the impact, the tank maintained forward momentum. Carlson unleashed another controlled burst, sustaining flame for 15 seconds until dense black smoke poured from every opening of the fortification.
The third pillbox required a different approach due to its concealment behind rocky terrain. Meza ordered Morrison to advance to within 80 yards, dangerously close to Japanese infantry positions. As the tank reached a small rise, enemy soldiers emerged from hidden spider holes, charging with satchel explosives and magnetic mines. The bow gunner opened fire with a .30 caliber machine gun, yet some attackers managed to reach the tank's blind spots. At this critical moment, the CBH-1's full turret traverse demonstrated its advantage over conventional flamethrower tanks, which could only fire forward. Carlson rotated the turret a full 180 degrees, directing flame onto the approaching infantry, resulting in a catastrophic defensive failure. Observers likened the eruption to the gates of hell opening. With the third pillbox neutralized, the 21st Marine Regiment advanced approximately 400 yards in 2 hours, an achievement surpassing their progress over the previous 48 hours. Reports of these results spread quickly through the Marine communications network. Flamethrower tanks were proving both effective and survivable, unlike standard armor. Within 6 hours, all 8 deployed flamethrower tanks were actively engaging the front lines. Tank 434, supporting the 23rd Marines near East Boat Basin, destroyed 4 fortified positions in a single afternoon. The crews developed a tactic termed corkscrew and burn, approaching targets in a spiral to minimize exposure to anti-tank fire while maintaining continuous flame coverage. The psychological effect of these operations proved as significant as their physical destruction. Japanese defenders trained to hold their positions to the death began abandoning their posts upon seeing the approaching flame tanks. Marine riflemen were initially too stunned to fire. Within half an hour, an entire defensive sector collapsed without the tank directly targeting a single position. This marked the first large-scale abandonment of positions in Japanese military history. By the evening of February 20th, Marine units were already reorganizing tactics to integrate flamethrower tanks as a central component of assault operations. The success of the CBH-1 not only accelerated territorial gains, but also fundamentally altered the approach to fortified position combat in the Pacific theater, combining direct physical destruction with unparalleled psychological impact on enemy forces. Operations involving the flame-throwing tanks were deferred until the specialized vehicles could be moved into forward positions. Infantry units were trained to maintain a distance of roughly 50 yards behind these tanks, close enough to exploit the disorienting effect on the enemy, yet far enough to avoid the intense heat capable of causing burns at around 30 yards. Artillery observers adjusted their targeting priorities, focusing on areas suited for flamethrower assaults rather than relying solely on conventional bombardment. The initial results from the deployment of flame tanks were remarkable. 47 enemy fortifications were destroyed on the first day. Casualties among Marine forces in sectors receiving flame tank support dropped by nearly 40% compared to previous engagements.
Previously stagnant lines saw gains of up to 600 yards within hours. However, the most profound effect was psychological. Significant numbers of Japanese troops began abandoning their positions, a behavior rarely observed before. Despite a swift reaction, Japanese countermeasures proved largely ineffective. That night, General Kuribayashi issued urgent directives, marking flame tanks as the highest priority targets. All available 47mm anti-tank artillery was instructed to concentrate on these vehicles. Specialized assault teams were formed, consisting of volunteers carrying explosive charges on their bodies prepared for close-range attacks. Infantry units received orders to aim for the tank's vision ports with precision rifle fire, attempting to incapacitate the crews. Yet the fundamental challenge persisted. Flamethrower tanks were visually indistinguishable from standard Sherman tanks until they activated their flame projectors. This made them extremely difficult to neutralize before they inflicted significant damage. Additionally, any focus on flame tanks meant diverting attention from conventional Shermans, which were providing essential suppressive fire. The Americans had achieved a notable tactical advantage through this technological innovation. On February 23, D+4, the day the Marines raised the flag atop Mount Suribachi, the flamethrower tanks faced a critical trial. The 3rd Marine Division launched an operation to seize Hill 382, the second highest elevation on Iwo Jima and a pivotal component of Kuribayashi's northern defensive line. The hill featured an extensive network of bunkers and tunnels descending 7 stories underground. Every potential approach had been pre-registered with artillery and mortars, making the position exceptionally difficult to capture. Previous assaults had resulted in losses exceeding 50%, with the 1st Battalion of the 9th Marines losing 70% of its personnel merely attempting to reach the hill's outer defenses. At 800 hours, 4 flame tanks advanced in echelon accompanied by 6 conventional Sherman tanks and a battalion of Marine infantry. Japanese forces, however, were prepared. They had positioned 75mm mountain guns, more powerful than standard 47mm anti-tank weapons, to specifically counter the flame tanks. As the lead flame tank traversed the first rise, concentrated enemy fire immobilized Tank 433 when its track was destroyed. Despite being stationary, the crew continued projecting flames, creating a protective barrier of fire that hindered Japanese defensive fire and allowed the following tanks to advance.
Tank 431 pressed forward through a dense curtain of smoke, enduring artillery bombardment that would have halted a conventional infantry assault. Shell fragments struck the armor continuously, while driver Private First Class Morrison later described relying on a periscope to navigate through visibility limited to approximately 10 feet. At 60 yards from the main bunker complex, Tank 434 unleashed its flamethrower. Japanese engineers had anticipated such attacks, equipping bunkers with steel shutters over firing apertures that could be closed between defensive bursts. Initially, the flame had little effect. Gunner Corporal Michael Rodriguez noted that after prolonged exposure, the steel plates glowed red from the heat. Maintaining fire for 45 seconds, well beyond standard operating procedure and at risk of exhausting fuel reserves, he observed the metal begin to warp, creating openings. Incendiary fuel then penetrated the gaps, engulfing the bunker's interior. Secondary explosions revealed previously hidden tunnel entrances, exposing Japanese positions to Marine infantry armed with satchel charges. Within 3 hours, outer defenses of Hill 382 were breached, demonstrating the formidable but not limitless power of flame tanks. Fuel limitations posed a significant operational constraint. Tank 431, after 80 seconds of continuous flame, depleted its fuel reserves and had to withdraw to specialized refueling points, a process requiring at least 2 hours. During these intervals, enemy forces could regroup, highlighting that while the tanks provided a decisive edge, their effectiveness depended on careful coordination and logistical support. The assault on Hill 382 exemplified both the extraordinary tactical impact and the practical limitations of the flamethrower tanks in the Pacific Theater. On the same day, Corporal Herschel Woody Williams demonstrated the continuing strategic importance of man-portable flamethrowers in combat operations. When the flamethrower-equipped tanks were unable to traverse a narrow ravine known as the amphitheater, Williams took the initiative to advance on foot, carrying a 70-pound M22 flamethrower. Over a grueling 4-hour engagement, supported by only 4 riflemen, 2 of whom lost their lives defending him, he successfully neutralized 7 pillboxes that were otherwise unreachable by armored vehicles. Williams' actions filled a critical tactical gap, complementing the capabilities of flame tanks. Where mechanized units could not penetrate, determined infantry armed with portable flamethrowers could continue the assault. For his extraordinary bravery and effectiveness, Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor. He would later become the last living Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, passing away in June 2022 at the age of 98. His official citation highlighted his readiness to volunteer in the face of overwhelming obstacles, noting that he advanced to reduce the intense machine gun fire from reinforced enemy positions, while tanks struggled to clear a path for the infantry. Data collected from the first week of the campaign underscored the tactical impact of flamethrowers. In sectors where flame tanks were deployed, Marine casualties dropped by approximately 40% compared to assaults conducted without their support. Japanese fortifications that had withstood prolonged conventional attacks collapsed within hours when subjected to coordinated flamethrower operations. During the initial 7 days of action, 8 flame tanks consumed roughly 70,000 gallons of fuel mixture, destroying an estimated 300 fortified positions. Maintaining this pace required a dedicated logistical effort, including the establishment of forward fuel depots capable of sustaining a daily average consumption of 10,000 gallons. By early March, the fight had moved to the northern plateau of Iwo Jima, a terrain dominated by sulfur pits, jagged ravines, and volcanic rock outcroppings that severely limited tank mobility. Recognizing the defensive advantages provided by this terrain, General Kuribayashi had established his final line of resistance here. Marines came to refer to the area as the meat grinder, with some attacks costing as many as 850 casualties for the capture of a single hill. Tanks attempting to cross this broken landscape often became immobilized, their tracks damaged by jagged volcanic stone or blocked by obstacles buried beneath layers of ash. Despite these challenges, tanks adapted, effectively transforming into mobile strongpoints. Where they could not maneuver freely, the tanks were positioned strategically to provide suppressive fire, supporting the advance of infantry units.
5th Engineer Battalion personnel labored through the night under sniper fire to construct ramps and clear paths, enabling flame tanks to reach positions previously deemed inaccessible. In situations where a direct approach was impossible, tank crews employed indirect firing techniques, using terrain features to bounce streams of flame around corners and into protected enemy positions. On March 8, D+17, tank number 436 executed what its crew described as an impossible shot. Supporting the 9th Marines' assault on Cushman's Pocket, a network of caves and bunkers embedded in a nearly vertical cliff, Sergeant Daniel Foster, the tank commander, calculated that by firing the flamethrower at maximum elevation from a tilted position, the napalm could arc over the cliff edge and strike Japanese defenders from above. The CBH-1 flamethrower could elevate only to 35 degrees, yet Foster managed to angle the tank atop rubble from prior naval bombardment to achieve the needed trajectory. With the vehicle precariously balanced and mortar rounds impacting nearby, Corporal Anthony Vitelli fired the flamethrower, sending molten napalm in a high arc that descended onto the enemy positions. The impact was devastating both physically and psychologically, shattering the defenders' sense of security. Many Japanese soldiers, previously confident that their elevated positions were immune to such attacks, leapt from the cliffs rather than face immolation. By mid-March, flamethrower tanks had become central to a coordinated assault framework. Each tank operated with a dedicated support contingent, conventional armor for neutralizing anti-tank threats, infantry to guard against close assaults by enemy combatants, engineers to clear obstacles, and fuel handlers who brought forward 300-gallon fuel trailers to extend operational duration. This level of integration marked a significant evolution in Marine Corps assault tactics, establishing a model that would influence doctrine for decades. The logistical demands of this system were immense. Electricians made second-class Kissel, one of the Flamethrowers' original designers, accompanied the tanks to Iwo Jima to oversee maintenance. He later described the extensive supply chain required to sustain the 8 operational tanks, which stretched all the way back to Pearl Harbor. Fuel mixing stations operated continuously, combining precise proportions of diesel, gasoline, and napalm powder. Any delay in use risked separation of the mixture and clogging of the flamethrower systems, necessitating consumption within 72 hours of preparation. The Japanese, in turn, adapted to counter the flamethrowers. Specialized tank killer teams emerged, employing explosive charges strapped to their bodies in suicide attacks. While these human-borne explosives achieved limited success, such as the destruction of tank number 438 on March 11, which resulted in 3 crew fatalities, they ultimately could not halt the relentless flow of replacements and repairs. Observing from his command bunker beneath the northern plateau, General Kuribayashi came to understand the strategic significance of these weapons. In his final dispatch to Imperial Command, transmitted on March 17, he remarked that the enemy's specialized flamethrower tanks had demonstrated a level of effectiveness surpassing all combined artillery and aerial bombardment. These weapons could accomplish in a matter of minutes what conventional ordnance would take days to achieve. There is no practical countermeasure against this armament, he noted, observing that the Americans relied not only on superior forces, but also on a remarkable inventiveness in combat. The decisive phase unfolded during the last days of March as U.S. Marines advanced into a rugged network of ravines and tunnels, the last defensive stronghold of General Kuribayashi. The Marines soon dubbed this area the Bloody Gorge, due to its complexity and the intensity of resistance encountered. Within less than a 700-yard square, approximately 3,000 Japanese defenders were preparing for their final confrontation. On March 21, designated D+30, all operational flamethrower tanks, 6 of the original 8, with 2 undergoing repairs, were mobilized for a coordinated offensive. 4 additional flame tanks, hastily sent from Hawaii, reinforced them. Although these newer models were equipped with the less powerful Runson system, capable of reaching only 60 to 80 yards, the assault represented the largest single concentration of flamethrower vehicles in the Pacific Theater.
Tank 431, restored after being disabled on Hill 382, spearheaded the formation. Its hull displayed the scars of numerous engagements, patched armor from shell impacts, dents from near misses, and burn marks from explosive fragments. Tank 433, distinguished by a temporary track repair that caused the distinctive clanking noise, held the left wing. Tanks 434, 436, and 437 advanced through the center, with 432 securing the right flank. At 1,000 hours, the tanks moved forward in a crescent configuration, producing interlaced streams of fire that denied Japanese defenders any exploitable dead zones. Marine infantry followed closely, employing white phosphorus grenades to mark cave entrances for flamethrower targeting. Combat engineers then used demolition charges to seal positions cleared by the advancing flame tanks. Despite the ferocity of the Japanese resistance, the defenders' efforts were increasingly ineffectual. Suicide squads emerging from hidden spider holes were instantly incinerated before reaching American lines. Anti-tank teams fired at close range, maintaining their positions even as fire engulfed them. One remarkable episode occurred when a Japanese officer charged Tank 434 while wielding a samurai sword. The tank's bow gunner hesitated to fire, possibly out of shock or respect, allowing nearby Marines to eliminate the officer just yards from the vehicle. The officer's sword was later preserved at Marine Corps headquarters as a testament to the desperation and determination of the defenders. By nightfall on March 21, the Marines had penetrated the gorge. Over 800 Japanese troops were killed, many beyond recognition due to flames. Tanks consumed approximately 8,000 gallons of fuel mixture in a single day, establishing a new operational record for the campaign. Marine casualties, though significant, 92 killed and 257 wounded, were far lower than what would have been expected in a conventional assault. However, the human cost extended beyond battlefield fatalities. Tank crews experienced severe psychological strain from witnessing the effects of the flamethrowers. Corporal Carlson of Tank 431 later recounted the haunting sounds and odors, screams of the dying, the pervasive smell of burning flesh mingled with volcanic sulfur, and the trauma of handling human remains fused to tank tracks, requiring blowtorches for removal. The vehicles themselves were under extreme mechanical stress. Transmissions failed from volcanic ash, fuel lines became clogged with carbon residues, and track pins broke under the weight of added armor plates. By late March, sustaining even 4 functional tanks required scavenging parts from damaged units. Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945. The battle had extended to 36 days, far exceeding the projected 5-day operation. American forces suffered 26,038 casualties, including 6,821 killed, figures that shocked both the public and military leadership. Japanese losses were nearly total. Of roughly 21,000 defenders, only 216 were captured alive, the remainder either killed in action or committing suicide to avoid capture, or death by fire. Flamethrower tanks fundamentally altered the battle's dynamics. Post-battle analyses estimated that they reduced American casualties by approximately 5,000 and destroyed over 1,000 fortified positions, consuming nearly 360,000 gallons of fuel mixture in the process. More significantly, they shattered the myth of Japanese invulnerability in fortified positions. Captain Frank Caldwell of Company F, 26th Marines, summarized the impact succinctly. It was the flamethrower tanks, more than any other support arm, that secured the victory. Traditional bombardment, artillery, naval gunfire, and aerial attacks had failed to dislodge the defenders from their subterranean positions, whereas flame tanks accomplished what nothing else could. Statistical assessments confirmed their effectiveness. Over 30% of Japanese fatalities were caused by flame weapons, and sectors with tank support saw a 3-fold increase in advance speed compared to unsupported assaults. Japanese prisoners, a rarity in Pacific battles, numbered 216, with many explicitly citing the fear of being burned alive as their reason for surrender. The lessons learned at Iwo Jima had far-reaching implications for Marine Corps assault tactics, demonstrating the decisive role of flamethrower vehicles in modern warfare.
In the immediate aftermath of their early successes, the Marine Corps submitted an urgent demand for 54 additional flamethrower tanks, anticipating their necessity in upcoming Pacific campaigns. At Schofield Barracks, Colonel Oom's engineering group responded with extraordinary speed. Assigned a AAA production priority, the same classification given to the B-29 program and the Manhattan Project, the team worked under pressures usually reserved for national-level strategic projects. Their efforts culminated in a redesigned model, designated the CBH-2, which offered greater firing distance and significantly improved mechanical dependability. By June 1945, the assembly lines had delivered 70 new flame-equipped tanks in preparation for Operation Downfall, the massive invasion of Japan that never ultimately materialized. Observing how effective Marine armor had been at Eniwetok and later at Iwo Jima, the U.S. Army accelerated its own mechanized flamethrower program. For the Okinawa operation, the entire 713th Tank Battalion was restructured and outfitted exclusively with flame tanks.
During the prolonged Okinawa campaign, spanning April through June 1945, Army units burned through roughly 200,000 gallons of specialized fuel mixture. These armored flamethrowers proved as devastating in the island's southern cave systems as their marine predecessors had been further north. What had started as a stopgap solution improvised under battlefield conditions evolved into an indispensable equipment across the Pacific theater. Yet the implications of this shift extended beyond questions of tactics. Centuries-old Japanese military concepts, particularly the emphasis on personal bravery and spiritual endurance, collapsed when confronted by overwhelming American technological and industrial output. The flamethrower tanks symbolized more than a brutal innovation. They represented an era in which industrial capacity became the decisive factor in ground warfare. Production figures illustrated this transformation with stark clarity. By the end of hostilities, Colonel Um's unit had put together 354 operational flame tanks. The CBS facilities at Schofield Barracks produced 226,334 gallons of thickened fuel, supported by a napalm mixing plant capable of generating 1,000 gallons every single day. This industrial infrastructure, replicated in multiple locations across the Pacific, allowed American forces to literally carve paths through entrenched Japanese positions. Despite the scale of their achievements, the men responsible for these machines remained largely unknown to the public. Machinists made Reicher and electricians made Kissel, who played central roles in fabricating the flame systems, returned to civilian life without fanfare. Their names faded into footnotes of obscure after-action documents. Colonel continued his career in chemical weapons development until retirement, his crucial contributions recognized only within specialized military circles. The soldiers and Marines who operated these vehicles bore a different burden. Many struggled in later years with psychological trauma, what would eventually be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder. The memory of caves turned into infernos, of voices abruptly extinguished by fire, left scars that rarely faded. Sergeant Mezer, for example, avoided discussing his wartime experiences until near the end of his life in 1993. Only then did he confide to a grandson that although no one should take pride in burning enemy soldiers alive, he believed those tanks had spared countless Americans. That, he said, was the thought that allowed him to sleep.
After the conflict, former flame tank crewmen gradually built an informal support circle. They gathered annually in Hawaii, returning to the same Schofield Barracks complex where their weapons had been engineered. The meetings never attracted press attention and were intentionally kept quiet. They offered the veterans a rare space to confront memories too horrific for ordinary conversation. Attendance dwindled over time, and by the final reunion in 2010, only 4 members of the original crews were still alive. Japanese accounts appeared slowly, pieced together from interrogation transcripts and confiscated military papers. Many Japanese soldiers, raised on a martial tradition that equated battlefield death with spiritual elevation, found themselves psychologically overwhelmed by the threat of being burned alive. For numerous defenders, abandoning defensive tunnels felt less shameful than remaining to perish in what they described as underground furnaces. The psychological toll inflicted by flamethrower-equipped tanks marked a turning point in Japanese military history, prompting some of the first large-scale surrenders. Lieutenant Yamada, who witnessed the initial deployment of these flame tanks on February 20th, survived the engagement and was among the 216 captured soldiers. In his post-war debriefing with American intelligence officers, he reflected on the unprecedented nature of the threat. "We were ready to face bullets, artillery shells, bayonets, even starvation, but we were completely unprepared for fire that relentlessly hunted us through the depths of our bunkers. The flamethrower tanks shattered our morale in ways no ordinary weapon could achieve. They turned our strongest defenses, the underground fortifications we trusted with our lives, into tombs." Similarly, former Sergeant Masao Hayashi, who was captured after being burned while fleeing a bunker, offered a harrowing account. The napalm attacks surged like a tidal wave, penetrating every corner of the defenses. Soldiers attempting to escape through emergency exits encountered flames waiting for them. Some chose to end their own lives rather than succumb to fire, while others dashed into American gunfire, preferring bullets over incineration. I saw men who had been hardened veterans since China freeze in terror at the sight of approaching flame tanks. This was a form of death we had never trained to face, Hayashi recalled. The revolutionary impact of these flamethrower tanks extended beyond the battlefield and into post-war military doctrine. The U.S. Marine Corps, analyzing the success at Iwo Jima, redefined assault operations to emphasize integrated arms, combining tanks, infantry, and combat engineers. The concept of customizing armored vehicles for specific tactical challenges became a cornerstone of modern military planning. Future weapons development increasingly prioritized versus.
The technology itself continued to evolve. M4A3R3 Sherman flamethrower tanks saw action in the Korean War, proving effective against Chinese bunker networks during engagements at the Punch Bowl and Heartbreak Ridge. During the Korean conflict, Marine flame tanks destroyed more than 300 enemy fortifications, though the effect was somewhat muted as Chinese forces had gained better understanding of the weapon's capabilities. The final U.S. flamethrower tank, the M132, mounted on an M113 armored personnel carrier, remained in service until 1978, bringing to a close a lineage that began with just 8 Sherman tanks hastily converted in a secret Hawaiian facility. By that time, thermobaric devices and precision-guided munitions had largely supplanted flamethrowers as the preferred tools for clearing fortified positions. International law later imposed restrictions on flamethrowers through Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, limiting the use of incendiary devices. The weapon that had once decisively shaped the outcome at Iwo Jima became morally contentious as public opinion increasingly viewed it as excessively cruel. Yet historians note an ironic twist. Despite the horror they caused, flamethrower tanks likely shortened the battle and prevented thousands of additional casualties that a conventional assault would have inflicted. The industrial achievement underpinning these tanks was remarkable. Of the 49,234 Shermans produced by the United States during World War II, only 354 were converted into flamethrower variants. Still, these relatively few vehicles had an outsized impact. At Iwo Jima, 8 tanks alone altered the course of a battle that might otherwise have dragged on for months, potentially causing tens of thousands more casualties. The estimated production cost of roughly $200,000 per converted tank in 1945 pales in comparison to the human lives preserved. Military analysts have suggested that each flame tank at Iwo Jima may have prevented around 625 American casualties, based on comparisons of supported versus unsupported assaults. In the stark calculus of war, investment in technological innovation yielded substantial dividends in lives saved. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the flamethrower tank was psychological. These weapons demonstrated that technological ingenuity could overcome even the most fanatical resistance. The era of individual heroism on the battlefield was giving way to an age where victory depended on industrial capacity, technical skill, and the coordinated application of advanced machinery. Even the legendary samurai spirit could not withstand fire delivered by mass-produced machines. Beneath the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima, beneath the monuments honoring courage and sacrifice, rest the remains of more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers who fell defending positions they believed impregnable. Thousands of soldiers perished under weapons they could scarcely have envisioned. Their deaths did not merely signify the conclusion of a battle, they marked the collapse of an era in which sheer courage or spiritual determination could counter material inferiority. At the Battle of Iwo Jima, 8 M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks were deployed. machines forged from steel, aluminum, rubber, and countless other components. Every piece was crafted by civilians far removed from the front lines, yet the tanks themselves symbolized the full force of American industrial power, technological ingenuity, and engineering expertise mobilized for the purpose of victory. The engineers who built them, the Marines who operated them, and the Japanese soldiers who confronted them were all participants in a transformation that redefined modern combat.
The last surviving flamethrower tank from Iwo Jima, designated Tank 434, is now preserved at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. Its battered hull tells of the intense battles it endured: welded patches reinforcing damaged armor, dents from shrapnel, and scratches from volcanic debris. A small plaque lists its specifications and operational history, yet it cannot convey the sensory reality of flame warfare. The hiss of compressed nitrogen, the acrid smoke of burning napalm mingled with sulfur, or the horrifying sight of molten fire streaming into fortified positions. Museum visitors often move quickly past the exhibit, unsettled by its lethal purpose. School children on educational trips ask why humanity would devise such destructive devices. Veterans linger longer, some offering salutes, others standing quietly in contemplation. To them, the tank is not a symbol of glory, but a reminder of the grim necessities of war. The final reunion of Iwo Jima flame tank veterans occurred in 2015, on the 70th anniversary of the battle. Only 3 surviving crew members attended, all in their 90s. They gathered within the museum, recounting memories to historians determined to preserve first-hand testimony. Corporal Anthony Vitelli, gunner of Tank 436, reflected with measured clarity. "People ask if I'm proud of what we did. Pride isn't right. We performed a grim task that had to be done. Those tanks saved lives. That's all that matters." Nearly all those who contributed to these machines, designers, manufacturers, and crews, have passed away. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, who fought alongside flamethrower tanks using a portable model, was the last Medal of Honor recipient from Iwo Jima to die, passing in June 2022 at age 98. With him vanished the final living witness to the brutal reality of flame warfare, though his foundation continues to honor the families of the fallen, ensuring their sacrifices endure in memory. Declassified reports from Colonel Unmar, released in the 1970s, reveal the extraordinary pace of production that birthed the flamethrower tanks. Working grueling 20-hour days, sleeping in shifts beside welding machines, engineers achieved in weeks what conventional military procurement could have required years to accomplish. Their efforts culminated in a decisive battlefield innovation that shortened one of the Pacific War's bloodiest campaigns. Japanese military records, opened to researchers decades later, detail the paralyzing effect of facing flamethrower tanks. Accounts describe the futility of relying on concrete bunkers or steel fortifications against advancing streams of fire. Orders to defend positions to the last man became meaningless when death arrived as liquid flame infiltrating every tunnel and trench. One report stated, "The flamethrowers nullified every advantage of our defensive positions. Elevation meant nothing, as fire arced over obstacles. Depth offered no safety, as flames flowed like water into our tunnels. Even reinforced concrete, designed to withstand massive explosives, could not resist liquid fire."
General Kuribayashi's final radio message, sent just before his death in March 1945, highlighted the broader significance of this technological shift. "The Americans have overcome us not merely through superior numbers or firepower, but by employing superior imagination, turning our strongest defenses into instruments of death. Future conflicts will favor those who innovate, not those who perfect old methods. His foresight proved accurate. The principles demonstrated by these 8 flamethrower tanks, technological innovation overcoming entrenched tactics, would resonate through later conflicts, from guided missiles and precision munitions to cyber operations. The transition from conventional assault to flame-assisted tactics occurred in mere days, yet fundamentally altered military doctrine. Marines trained for traditional frontal attacks adapted quickly to coordinate with flamethrower tanks, exploiting their shock effect to shatter lines thought impregnable. This coordination emerged organically in the heat of battle, exemplifying a remarkable degree of adaptability under fire. Post-war statistical analysis confirmed the psychological impact of the flamethrowers. Japanese defenders in sectors where flame tanks operated were 70% more likely to abandon positions before direct engagement. In many instances, the mere presence of a flamethrower was enough to trigger defensive collapse. One Marine intelligence report observed, enemy soldiers display near panic at the sight of these tanks. Prisoners consistently report refusal to occupy positions once flamethrowers are detected nearby. In just 36 days of fighting, the 8 flamethrower tanks at Iwo Jima achieved a profound effect. They validated a new form of warfare, preserved thousands of American lives, and contributed decisively to one of World War II's pivotal battles. Their legacy persisted in every subsequent conflict involving entrenched adversaries, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq. Yet the moral dimension of their efficiency, the industrialized scale of fiery destruction, remains unresolved, leaving surviving crew members to wrestle with the grim calculus of necessity and ethical responsibility. The men who operated the flamethrower tanks had been agents of an unavoidable and terrible necessity. They commanded machines capable of reducing human life to ashes in moments. For many of these veterans, recounting their service remained too painful. Their memories of destruction were carried quietly to their graves rather than shared with others. One of the rare moments of reconciliation occurred in 1985 on Iwo Jima during a ceremony that brought together those on opposite sides of history. Former tank commander Robert Veza and former Lieutenant Koshi Yamada, who had witnessed the first flamethrower assault, stood on the spot where Tank 431 had discharged its fiery weapon 40 years before. Yamada, through an interpreter, admitted the long-held resentment he carried. 40 years of hatred toward those who had caused the deaths of his comrades in ways that haunted him still. Yet he acknowledged a broader truth. War transforms everyone involved into instruments of violence. We all acted as we had to, he said. Meza, in turn, reflected simply on their shared youth and struggle. We were just boys trying to survive. I am grateful we are both here today. The two veterans embraced, a moment of human reconciliation against the backdrop of Iwo Jima's black sand coast as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Mount Suribachi loomed silently behind them, a reminder of the island's volcanic origins and its violent past. The island, once engulfed in combat, had gradually returned to peace. The era of the flamethrower tank, its emergence, deployment, and ultimate retirement, was a uniquely Pacific War phenomenon, leaving a legacy of fire that reshaped military tactics. Only 8 Sherman tanks had been modified with flamethrowers, yet their effect on the battlefield was profound. These machines illustrated the marriage of American industrial capacity with battlefield ingenuity, proving that modern warfare could be dominated not just by courage, but by technological advantage applied with tactical precision. The tanks were instruments of their era, brutal, necessary, and decisive. On the opposing side, Japanese forces had mounted extraordinary resistance. They constructed an extensive subterranean fortress, one that conventional artillery and small arms could not penetrate. But the innovation of the flamethrower tank turned hidden bunkers and caves into lethal traps of molten fuel, neutralizing even the most elaborate defenses. The confrontation was not a question of bravery. Japanese soldiers fought with exceptional valor, adhering to orders that demanded absolute resistance.
yet they encountered an unprecedented technological force. The numbers tell a stark story. 8 flamethrower tanks, 360,000 gallons of fuel mixture, over 1,000 fortified positions destroyed, and an estimated 5,000 American casualties averted. Flames alone accounted for the deaths of more than 6,000 Japanese soldiers. A campaign that could have lasted months concluded in just 36 days. Here, strategy and innovation directly translated into lives saved and objectives achieved. Today, the island, renamed Iwo and returned to Japanese governance, bears few visible scars. Nature has reclaimed the terrain. Volcanic soil fills trenches, vegetation cloaks craters, and the surface seems serene. Yet beneath lie the remains of countless soldiers, trapped within collapsed tunnels and sealed caves, their sacrifices fading from memory as fewer witnesses remain. General Holland Smith, commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps at Iwo, would later reflect on the battle in his memoirs. He acknowledged the flamethrower tanks as the defining factor between victory and disaster, conceding that without them, the cost of securing the island would have been catastrophic. Though horrific in their function, these weapons ultimately preserved more lives than any other deployed system. The physical flames have long vanished, and the men who operated them have mostly passed from the world. Yet the broader implications of their use, where industrial power met tactical innovation, continue to influence military thought globally. In 8 modified Shermans, the United States discovered the capability to breach the most formidable fortress in the Pacific, forever altering how wars were waged. The battle concluded, and the wider conflict was nearing its end. Yet the resonance of those flames, the hiss of compressed nitrogen, the flow of incendiary liquid into hidden bunkers, and the agonized silences left by instantaneous destruction remains embedded in military history. The age when individual heroism alone determined outcomes had given way to an era where technological supremacy dictated the course of combat, a transformation born in fire on a small volcanic island in the Pacific.